Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. So today we're going to be tackling a topic that's been all over the news lately.
Yeah.
USA Day. Um, yeah, it seems like everyone's got an opinion about it these days, and things are getting pretty heated. I mean, we've been digging through news articles, government statements, even court documents. And it's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And what's interesting to me is how this whole USAID situation is kind of a microcosm, of this bigger debate about America's role in the world. Like, how does a country with so much power and influence use that for good? Or maybe not so good, depending on who you ask.
Right. It's definitely a big picture issue. But before we get too far down that rabbit hole, maybe we should take a step back for a second, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Like, what is USAID exactly? What do they actually do?
Okay, so USAID stands for the United States Agency for International Development. And it's been around for a while. Actually, it goes all the way back to 1961. President Kennedy created it right smack in the middle of the Cold War. The idea was to kind of fight fire with fire, The Soviets were spreading their influence all over the place, so the U.S. wanted to offer an alternative. And they did that by providing assistance to other countries, economic development, humanitarian aid, that kind of thing.
So basically it was a way to combat communism back then.
Yeah, that was definitely a big part of it in the early days. But over the years, USAID's mission has broadened a lot. Now they work in over 120 countries on a huge range of issues. Everything from disaster relief after earthquakes or famines to long-term development projects focused on, reducing poverty, improving healthcare education, economic opportunities in developing countries.
Wow. So it sounds like they have their fingers in a lot of pies.
Right.
And it's worth pointing out here that the U.S. is the biggest provider of humanitarian aid in the world. And a lot of that aid flows through USAID, right?
Exactly. So yeah, they're doing a lot of good work around the globe.
Okay. So USAID helping people around the world sounds good so far. But I have a feeling that's not the whole story. Why is everyone so fired up about USAID right now?
Yeah, you're right. It's not all sunshine and roses. Like any large organization, USAID has its critics. Some people argue that it's become too bureaucratic, too inefficient, and too out of touch with real American interests. And this is where the current controversy comes in. The Trump administration has been extremely critical of USAID. And Elon Musk in particular has really gone after them.
Elon Musk, right? I forgot he's kind of running the show over at that new government efficiency department. What was it called again? DOGE? DOGE. It's kind of hard to take that seriously, isn't it? I keep thinking about that dog meme.
Yeah, I know. It's a strange name for a government department. But hey, maybe that's part of Musk's plan, Shake things up, get people talking. And he's definitely not afraid to speak his mind. He called USAID a viper's nest of radical left Marxists who hate America.
Whoa. Okay, so maybe he's not mincing words there. But beyond all the strong language, what are the actual concerns that have led to this push to dismantle USA?
Well, one of the main accusations is that USAID has become a wasteful bureaucracy, spending taxpayer dollars on projects that don't actually produce results. The Trump administration has been pointing to specific examples like funding a tourism program in Egypt or DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in Serbia.
DEI in Serbia, that's an interesting one.
Right. It just shows you how this debate touches on so many different issues.
So basically they're saying that USAID is throwing money at problems without any real accountability.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
But are there any broader criticisms beyond just, individual projects?
Yeah. There are. Some critics say that USAID often pushes a Western agenda that clashes with the values and cultures of the countries it's supposed to be helping. So it's this whole debate about cultural sensitivity versus promoting, universal values. It's a tricky issue. And it comes up a lot when you're talking about development work.
Right. It's like, how do you help people without imposing your own beliefs on them?
Exactly. It's a tough balancing act.
Okay. So we've got the waste argument and the cultural sensitivity argument. Anything else?
Oh, yeah. There are also allegations of USAID being involved in some shady stuff. Like the Trump administration claims that some USAID funding indirectly supported poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, which contributed to the Taliban's heroin production.
Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation. So given all this criticism, what has the Trump administration actually done about USA?
Well, they've actually taken some pretty drastic steps, and that's what we're going to dive into after the break.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dig into what the Trump administration has actually done regarding USAID.
Right, so it hasn't just been talk. They've taken some concrete actions, and some of them are pretty controversial.
Yeah, fill us in. What have they done so far?
Well, remember how I mentioned that funding freeze on Trump's first day in office? That was really just the tip of the iceberg. Since then, there have been furloughs, firings, and disciplinary leaves for USAID employees.
Oh, wow. So they're not messing around. It sounds like they're really trying to shake things up.
Yeah, and it goes even further. They actually removed the agency's computer servers. And for a while there, even the USA website was taken offline.
Seriously. Wow. I mean, I guess that's one way to disrupt an agency's work.
Right.
So what about that proposed workforce reduction we talked about earlier? What's the latest on that?
Right. That's been the biggest bombshell so far. The administration has proposed slashing the USA workforce from over 10,000 employees down to just 290.
Wait, 290? Are you serious? That's a reduction of what, like 97%?
Yeah, you heard that right. It's a massive downsizing. And as you can imagine, it's sparked a huge backlash.
I bet. So who's speaking out against this?
Well, pretty much everyone on the other side of the aisle. Democratic lawmakers have been incredibly vocal in their opposition. They're calling these actions everything from illegal and unconstitutional to a gift to America's adversaries. Senator Murphy, for example, called it a constitutional crisis. He's arguing that the executive branch is way overstepping its authority here.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a pretty extreme move to just gut an entire agency like that.
Right, and then you've got Congressman Raskin, who put it pretty bluntly. He said, "We don't have a fourth branch of government called Elon Musk."
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It definitely seems like Musk is playing a pretty big role in all this. But beyond the political rhetoric, has there been any actual pushback, like legally?
Oh, absolutely. This whole thing is playing out in the courts as well.
Really? Tell me more.
So several federal worker unions and advocacy groups have filed lawsuits trying to block the USAID cuts. Their argument is that these actions violate employee rights and that they're going to cause irreparable damage to America's global standing.
That makes sense. I mean, USA has been around for decades. It's a big part of how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world. So
Yeah.
I guess what they're saying is that gutting the agency would really hurt America's reputation and influence abroad.
Exactly. And on top of that, a judge recently restricted DOGE's access to Treasury payment systems.
Oh, wow. So that's got to be a major setback for Musk and the Trump administration.
Yeah, it definitely throws a wrench in their plans. It's going to make it a lot harder for them to implement these drastic changes.
So it sounds like this is a real legal battle brewing. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. Okay, so we've talked about the domestic response to all this, the political fallout, the lawsuits. But what about the international community? How are other countries reacting to the Trump administration's actions against USAID?
Well, it's interesting. It's not a universally negative response.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Who's actually supporting this?
Believe it or not, Hungary's government has actually been a vocal critic of USA for years.
Wow.
And they've kind of sided with the Trump administration on this one.
Wow. That's surprising. I mean, Hungary isn't exactly known for being on the same page as the U.S. on a lot of issues.
Yeah, it's definitely an unusual alliance. But Foreign Minister Szijjártó has been accusing USAID of meddling in Hungary's internal affairs. And he says they're pushing a liberal agenda that clashes with their more conservative culture.
So it sounds like that whole cultural sensitivity debate is playing out on the international stage as well.
Exactly. It's a complex issue, and it's not just theoretical. We're talking about real-world programs that impact the lives of millions of people.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the political back and forth,
Yeah.
but we can't forget about the human element here.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the specific programs that could be affected by these changes.
Yeah. Like, what about those HIV/AIDS programs you mentioned earlier? PEPFAR, I think it was called. How would that be impacted?
So PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, has been incredibly successful in combating HIV/AIDS globally, but it relies heavily on USAID funding. If those resources are cut back, it could have devastating consequences, not just for people in developing countries who depend on these programs, but for global health security as a whole.
Yeah. It's scary to think about what could happen if those programs are disrupted. It really highlights how interconnected we all are in this globalized world.
Right. What happens in one part of the world can quickly have ripple effects everywhere else.
Okay, so we've heard the arguments against USAID, the accusations of waste mismanagement, and promoting values that clash with other cultures. But let's be fair. What are the strongest points made by those who support the agency?
Well, they argue that USAID plays a crucial role in advancing American interests abroad. It's not just about humanitarian aid. They say it's about promoting democracy, stability, and economic development in strategically important regions. It's this whole idea of soft power, using aid and development to build relationships and influence events on the world stage.
So it's about more than just being charitable. It's about using aid strategically to achieve broader foreign policy objectives.
Exactly. And USAID supporters point to the agency's track record of success. They highlight initiatives like PEPFAR, which has literally saved millions of lives. They say dismantling USA would be incredibly short-sighted and could ultimately harm American interests in the long run.
So they're making the case that it's an investment, not just an expense.
Right. They argue that the benefits of USAID's work far outweigh the costs.
But what about those concerns about accountability and cultural sensitivity? Do USAID supporters address those issues?
Yeah, they do. They acknowledge that there have been instances of mismanagement and that cultural sensitivity is incredibly important. But they say that these issues can be addressed through reforms and better oversight, not by completely dismantling the agency.
So their argument is basically fix it, don't trash it.
Exactly. They believe that USAID can be made more efficient and effective without sacrificing its core mission.
It's a tough call. It seems like there are valid points on both sides of this debate. What do you think, ultimately, what does all this mean for the future of USAID and for America's role in the world?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's really hard to say what the future holds. This whole situation is so complex, and there are so many factors at play.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a crossroads. It's a pivotal moment for USAID and for U.S. foreign policy in general.
I agree. The decisions made in the coming months could have far-reaching consequences, both domestically and internationally.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've unpacked the arguments, explored the complexities, and considered the potential consequences. And it's clear that the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. But as with any complex issue, it's important for everyone to stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, and form their own conclusions.
That's right. We've tried to present the information and the different perspectives as objectively as possible. Now it's up to each of you to decide what you believe. What kind of future do you want to see for USAID, for America's role in the world, for the global community as a whole?
These are tough questions, but they're questions worth asking. And ultimately, the answers will shape the world we live in.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. So we've talked about what USAID is, we've talked about the criticisms and all the actions taken against it.
Yeah, we've really dug into the arguments and the politics and even the legal battles.
And now I think it's time to step back and think about, okay, what happens next?
Right. What are the potential consequences of all this for USA and for the world?
Exactly. I think our listeners are really trying to understand what the bigger picture is here.
Yeah, so let's think about the ramifications. Let's say USAID is really downsized, or even dismantled. What happens?
What happens?
The most immediate impact is going to be felt in those 120-plus countries where USAID works.
Right.
We're talking about the disruption of programs that a lot of people rely on. Like, remember those HIV/AIDS programs we talked about, PEPFAR? It's been a huge success in fighting the epidemic, but it relies heavily on USAID funding.
Right.
If that money dries up, well, it could be devastating.
Yeah. For the people who depend on those programs, of course.
Yeah.
But it's also a global health security issue, isn't it?
Exactly. What happens in one country can affect the entire world. And that's just one example. Think about education programs for girls in Afghanistan. They've made so much progress there. What happens to those programs if USAID disappears?
It makes you wonder, too, about the broader impact on development in general.
Right. USAID plays a big role in promoting economic growth and good governance. Without that, we could see more instability, more conflict, more displacement, and maybe even larger refugee crises.
And then those become global security threats.
Yes, exactly. Like a domino effect.
Like you said earlier.
Yeah.
You break it, you bought it. If the U.S. pulls back from the world stage, it can't just pretend there won't be consequences.
Right. And it's not just about the U.S. either. Other countries are going to step in to fill that void.
Yeah, like who?
Well, China, Russia, they've already been expanding their influence around the world.
Right.
And this could give them an even bigger opening.
So this whole USAID debate, it's about a lot more than just one agency.
It really is. It's about America's place in the world, its role as a global leader.
It's about the values it chooses to project.
Exactly. Does the U.S. want to build partnerships, promote cooperation, or retreat into isolationism and nationalism?
It feels like a pivotal moment.
It is. This is a fundamental disagreement about what the U.S. should be doing in the 21st century.
So where do we go from here? What happens next?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. It's hard to predict the future.
But we've laid out the arguments. We've explored the complexities. I think our listeners have a much better understanding now of what's at stake.
I hope so, because ultimately it's up to each individual to decide what they believe.
What kind of future do we want for USA Up, for America's role in the world, for the global community? It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it is. But these are important questions, questions that deserve our attention and careful consideration.
And the answers will shape the world we live in.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. Thanks for joining us.